So, fats, also known as lipids, are one of the macromolecules found within our diet. Fats are classified as hydrophobic and nonpolar. And hydrophobic essentially means non-water loving. So we'll just say hate water. Whereas hydrophilic means love water. So if hydrophobic means non-water loving, so it's hating water, and fats are defined as hydrophobic, that means that if we add fat to water, the fat will not dissolve in the water. And we see this example in real life because if we were to combine a glass of olive oil into a glass of water, we would see two very distinct layers of oil and water. That is because the fat is hydrophobic. So fats, what makes them hydrophobic is their long carbon chains. So fats are made up of two components. The first component is glycerol, and the second component is a fatty acid. So the fatty acid is essentially a long hydrocarbon chain. And the glycerol is a 3-carbon molecule. So glycerol is a 3-carbon molecule, but it has an OH on each carbon. So this is the structure of glycerol, and we see that right over here. And the fatty acid is just long carbon hydrogen chains. So we would see carbon, 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 and each carbon has hydrogens bound. So fat is made up of glycerol, and it is made up of 3 fatty acids. So we have 3 fatty acids because we have three carbons in the glycerol backbone, and each backbone needs 1 carbon chain. So each carbon chain, so the first carbon chain would attach here, the second one over here, and the third over here. And combining these two, we get a fat molecule, which we also call a triglyceride. It is a triglyceride because we have those 3 long fatty acid chains, and we have that glycerol backbone, which becomes the glyceride. Now, fatty acids that are less than 10 carbons, so if they have less than 10 carbons in their chain, they are known as short fats. A medium fat would be 12 to 14 carbons, and a long fat would consist of more than 16 carbons in the backbone. Now, fats are a very important macromolecule as they are used for insulation within our body, and they are used by the body to produce energy. So when the body is low on its carbohydrate storage, fats will be used as an alternative way to produce energy in the body. Fats are also an essential macromolecule, which is needed for vitamins that require fats for absorption. For example, vitamin D requires fat in order to be dissolved by the body. Fats are also present in our cell membrane. So we see that within our cells, we have that phospholipid bilayer, and that phospholipid bilayer consists of these fats. So fats also contribute to feeling full. So whenever we consume a diet or a meal that is high in fat, we will often feel satisfied and full after that meal. So within fats, we have 3 classes of fats, which are also known as lipids. So the 3 classes of lipids are phospholipids, sterols, and triglycerides. So the triglyceride is the structure I mentioned before. So when people talk about fats, they are most commonly referring to triglycerides. So the glycerol backbone and the 3 fatty acids. The phospholipid, on the other hand, is very similar to a triglyceride, but instead of having 3 fatty acids, we see 2 fatty acids because the 3rd carbon on the glycerol backbone has the phosphate-containing head group. So a phosphate-containing head group, essentially, we would see the two fatty acid chains, we would see a phosphate group on top. So if we were to draw this out, we would see the glycerol backbone. We would see fatty acid chain number 1, fatty acid chain number 2, and then we would see some phosphate containing group. And that's a phospholipid. And this is what we see in our cell membranes. Now, sterols, they are lipids in a ring structure. And the most common example of that is a cholesterol molecule. This is the structure of cholesterol, and we can see the various rings and the side chains that make up a sterol. There are also 3 types of fats. We have saturated, unsaturated, and trans fats. Saturated fats are defined as having no double bonds, so they are completely saturated with hydrogen, and they are solid at room temperature. And an example of this is animal fat. Animal fat will be solid at room temperature because it has no double bonds. And this is what a saturated fat looks like. It has no double bonds. It's completely saturated with hydrogen. An unsaturated fat, it has one or more double bond. So a monounsaturated fat means it has one point of unsaturation, and it's right over here because we see a double bond. A double bond signifies that we do not have a saturation of hydrogens. And that is because if we have this central carbon, and carbon is able to hold 4 bonds, so that means it's able to hold 4 hydrogens. But if our carbon has a double bond with the adjacent carbon, that carbon is only left with 3 hydrogens because carbon can only have 4 bonds. So this one over here is an example of an unsaturated carbon. This one is a saturated carbon because it has the maximum number of hydrogens. Now, when we talk about bonds, there are 2 different types of bonds we can have. We can have a trans bond or a cis bond. So a trans bond is when we have a double bond and the hydrogens are on opposite sides. So this would be a trans bond. But in a cis bond, we see the hydrogens on the same side. So that's the difference between trans and cis. So if we move one step further to trans fat, which is our 3rd type of fat, it is a type of unsaturated fat, but it has a trans bond. So it would have this bond over here. So the 3 types of fats are the saturated, which means it's completely saturated with hydrogen, the unsaturated, which means there are double bonds, which cause unsaturation, and unsaturated fats are liquid at room temps, so that's canola oil, olive oil, vegetable oil, fish oil. And trans fat is semi-solid at room temperature, and it has that trans configuration where the hydrogens are on opposite sides of one another.